cineware controls the pipeline of data between Cinema 4D Lite and After Effects. Now there are a number of settings within cineware that you can adjust to control just how much data or how little data you'd like to bring back and forth. Let's select layer 1 and go to our effects controls and look at some of these different options. The first thing you should note is the render settings. Notice there's a renderer. By default it's set to software. This is the lowest resolution representation as to what's going on in the scene within cinema. So if you scrub through your timeline, notice we do have some animation, and that animation is being represented by a software rendering of the actual model. If we want to go ahead and render this wouldn't be very high quality at all. So there are two other options. There's standard draft and then there's standard final. Let's choose standard final. Standard final is going to give me my final high resolution output quality. Now I'm still not quite seeing the full resolution because I'm at 50% magnification. So let's change that up to 100. Now you can see the edges and everything that is going to be output for my model. This renderer does tie directly to the render settings inside of camera. So these are the default settings from a typical Cinema 4D project. To speed up your workflow, you can turn on Keep Textures in RAM. Just underneath, when you do that, any textures that you had added in Cinema are going to get processed and then added into your cache. So every once in a while, if things aren't refreshing the way that you're expecting, you may need to go up under the Edit menu and go to Purge and just purge your image cache memory, or sometimes all memory in this cache. Now let's go ahead and skip down all the way to the bottom of our cineware options. Notice there's a button called Extract. If we click on that button, it's automatically going to extract any of the data that we have from our cinema project. So notice it's brought a camera over and multiple lights. These lights are lights that we can edit. If I double click the light, notice it has a color and I can definitely change that color. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and change that color from white to red. When I click OK, notice it's not going to change anything in my 3D render. That's because these lights, now that they're in After Effects, are just designed to light other After Effects elements. If you want to make changes to the lighting of your 3D object, you need to go back into cineware. So I'll just press Command Z to undo the latest light color change. Now go down and select layer 5, then press the U key on your keyboard. This will open up a bunch of position datas. The U key opens up any animated parameters. On this camera I've only got keyframes in one place, but that's in the position. Now if I wanted to fly some video boxes, say in front of our logo and behind our logo, I couldn't do that based on the way the camera is set up in the scene right now. So I can't move this camera anywhere else. If I do, it's not going to match what's actually got rendered out of Cinema. To give you a better example as to what I'm talking about, let's actually go back into the Cinema. But before we jump into Cinema, I'm going to select layer 5 and then shift click to select layer 1 and press delete on my keyboard. We can always re-extract any new data out of your Cinema file. This way, if I make any changes in Cinema, I'll make sure to update them in my After Effects project. So with layer 1 selected, press Command E or Control E to open the original file. Now that we're inside of Cinema, I of course could change the position of this camera and it would change how the 3D model moved through the scene. But how do I handle those flying boxes? Well, there are things called tags in Cinema, and those tags would allow certain information to move back and forth between Cinema and After Effects. But in order to add a tag to a specific place, I need to have something placed in that area of the scene. Now since I only want to see the logo, I don't want to place anything that can actually render. So of course this is a prime job for a null object. If you go up to the cube primitive button and click and hold, the first option we have is a null object. So let's go ahead and select that. This will function just like null objects inside of After Effects. If we rendered this scene, you wouldn't see anything. Now this null I'm going to use to position behind our logo. This will be where we fly our different video boxes behind the logo. Now since I'm in perspective view, I'm just going to middle mouse click to open up all 4 views. This way I can get a more accurate representation of where my null object's going to live in the 3D environment. Now that we've positioned our first null, we can go ahead and add a tag to get our position data for this null out of Cinema 4D and into our After Effects. With the null selected, go up to the tags area and go to Cinema 4D tags, and you want to apply the external compositing tag. This tag can actually generate a layer solid. So I want to go ahead and enable that by enabling solid, and we'll just leave the size set to 200 pixels by 100 pixels. I generally like to leave the solid red, just so I know exactly where it is when I bring this back into After Effects. Now let's create a second solid. I'm going to hold Command on my keyboard and click and drag on the null, making sure that I still have a left arrow pointing when I let go. Now I'll call this second null front position, and we can call the original null behind. Okay, so let's click on our front position null and position it in front of our logo. I want it kind off to the side, so I'm going to click and drag and make sure it's positioned off to the side. Now since I already had a tag applied to my original null when I copied the new null, I didn't have to create a second tag. Now we're ready to go ahead and save the project. I'll press Command S to save, and if we jump back into After Effects, then the project should update. Well, sort of. See, the project will update, yes, but the extra data that we want to pull from Cinema, we need to actually tell cineware to generate it again. So let's scroll down to the bottom of the cineware plugin and press the Extract button. Now you can see we have two null objects, our front position null and our behind null. And we also have the different lights in the scene. Now I'm going to click and drag the behind null, so it's literally behind our object in the 3D space. Now it's important once you extract the camera from Cinema that you don't try and move it around. Again, if we select layer 5 and press U, it already has a bunch of position keyframes. Now if we scrub through the scenes, you can see how this actually looks. You'll notice that our layer solid is actually indeed behind our 3D object. And even though the 3D object has transparency, it is allowing our null object to show through. So if you want to swap your own footage into the scene, you most definitely can. I'm going to press the space bar and just click up to reframe so we can see the edges of our null objects. Let's go to the project panel and open the still frames folder, and there we will open the still frame layers. Now select the front position null object. I'm going to click on the stair run layer. If you hold down Alt on Windows, Option on the Mac, and then click and drag the picture from the project panel down to the timeline, it'll swap our layer with a null object. Now it looks like the screen went black, and that's just because our frame was huge. So let's press S to open up the scale, and we'll change the scale down to 20% of its size. Now I can barely see what's going on with the runner. If we move through the scene, notice the lights are actually a little too far forward to illuminate our stair still. Now there are two ways to fix this. I could turn off the materials settings for layer 6, or I could just go ahead and position it a little further back in Z space. Since the camera is actually a 3D camera in After Effects, when I reposition my null object here, it is definitely respecting the 3D space created from our Cinema project. If I click and drag on the Z axis, notice I can never truly pass through the 3D object. I can just kind of move it back in the scene a little bit. The 3D object lives in its own little world here in the cineware plugin. Now let's change the scale of that image down to around 10%, just so it's not so dominant. And let's scroll down and select layer 8, and we can use the same Option drag technique or Alt drag on Windows. Let's go ahead and click and drag our throw still and swap it out with the behind layer. Now let's select our layer and press S to open up the scale, and we can scale our background layer down to around 20%. Now as we scroll through the scene, you can see that it's actually updating and respecting the true 3D nature of everything in the scene. So if you're trying to extract data from a 3D scene using Cinema 4D Lite, just remember all the power lies in the effects controls with the cineware plugin.